Incorporated in 1994, MTN is a multinational telecommunications group offering voice and data communications products and services to both individuals and businesses in 21 countries across 3 continents. MTN has a market cap of 256 billion rand and a price-earnings ratio of 12. The company is reportedly in danger of being whacked with sanctions by the United States for its telecommunications activities in Iran and in Syria. Well, we've seen the share price take a knock on the back of that negative news flow, and there are those that are very positive on MTN, like Paul Theron, who I'm sure accumulated when the stock came under pressure with that negative news flow. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and delicate situation. I mean, all of the many positive attributes of the stock have been mentioned ad nauseum. Big company now, well established, big 3 markets, South Africa, Nigeria, Iran, and now the Iranian thing. So the situation in Iran is not good. The currency has collapsed, the sanctions have been tightened, and it's principally the oil trade, which Iran depends upon for its fiscal revenues, which are really now being curtailed quite heavily. The US State Department is going around the world looking for banks and for industrial companies that operate in Iran and indicating either to the industrial companies or their banks that they're going to shut them down, close them out of the SWIFT network, that kind of thing. So it's very negative. There's the Turkcell case against MTN Irancell, which is based largely on leaks by a former MTN executive called Chris Kilowan, who basically gave a whole lot of paperwork from the company to Turkcell, which is a dastardly thing to do. But what can you do? This is business.
Obviously wasn't a very pleasant exit from MTN.
No, so now look, it is quite tricky to know whether this is all going to blow over or not, or whether the Iranian situation is going to turn for the better. Of course, the US and Iran have been at each other's throats for many, many decades. And the question is, for me anyway, is will this bite? Will the Iranians back down? Will they move away from their nuclear stuff? I think it could be a buying opportunity.
But what about the reputational damage that MTN could suffer in this scenario?
Yes, I mean, you look at corruption like this, there's 2 kinds of corruption. I think you can almost divide them, not legally, but morally. Right? There's the kind of corruption that you have to do in certain parts of the world just to get things done. So you've got to pay the street sweeper to sweep your streets, you've got to pay the policeman to actually handle the case properly. And that kind of corruption maybe is more morally, not as bad morally as the other kind of corruption in which you actually pay people or you engage in activities which are of themselves illegal. And the thing is, it may have started off that Iran, when MTN got to Iran, for instance, with the loan that they took, etc., or that the Iranians had to take in order to actually get the deal going, that MTN has to actually pay for that themselves. That could have been a case in which you have to actually pay these fees just to get anything done in that country. But there's also cases out there that are a bit dodgy, and especially with regards to like the Arab Spring protests and so on, in which people are saying that perhaps MTN was actually helping the Iranian government, wiretapping some of the protesters, and they could be involved in some kind of on a tangential basis with regards to some of the things that happened to these protesters later on, including torture, including murder as well. And those are the kind of things that are very, very difficult to actually wipe away even after you basically
find exactly. Torture, murder, things not to take lightly when you invest in MTN. This could be scandalous.
So here I am laughing at your allegations. No, look, I mean, the Iranian government, which owns basically 51% of Irancell, is of course monitoring the networks. And they are using the networks to try and catch the green protesters and lock them up. Iran is not a very friendly place. These things happen. The question of whether MTN, with its 49% stake there, is going to either sell it or get over this or somehow weasel their way out of this situation is really what we're talking about here. Because Iran came off a 0 base and now has more customers than South Africa. So
I remember having this debate with you, is it almost 5 years ago now, when we launched CNBC. MTN did trade at around about 165 Rand.
All-time high, briefly.
All-time high, briefly. But yes, you were still convinced at that point that the stock was a buy at 165. How are you feeling about it at 136?
For the last year, it's traded in this horrible band between 130 and 145, and every time it kind of advances, it retires. But a couple of things have happened. It's become a very big dividend payer.
Before
in the
we
interim.
go there,
yeah,
admit that at 165, you still thought MTN was a good buy. Or
look, at
is my memory being
165,
impaired?
well, I can't remember then as accurately as you appear to be able to, but at 165, they were in the throes of a buyout offer from the Reliance company in India, which didn't come to pass. But apart from like a couple of days, 165 wasn't the real trading price of this thing. But for me, it's about the 150 million customers. in the most exciting industry in the entire world. So, you know, the price you pay today is a mere trifle compared to where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years' time.
Is that the crux of the issue? 150 million customers. You can't ignore that, irrespective of any negative news flow.
I think of all the stocks being discussed today, the upside is probably the best with MTN with regards to just how much ability. I mean, if Nigeria takes off, I mean, Nigeria is still, remember, a much larger asset for them than Iran is. Even though Iran has been doing quite nicely in the last few years or so. So should Africa take off? Should we have the 6.5% African growth rate move on to 8% or even continue 6.5% for several years down the line? Obviously, these are very positive impacts on MTN. But taking that into account, I mean, if Iran is a case in point, don't you think they also probably engage in similar things in Nigeria, which is also not exactly known for its, lack of corruption?
You mean where there's smoke, there's fire, and people could investigate further?
I think there's a lot of the territories MTN is involved in. These kind of things that happen in Iran are also likely to have occurred there. So if we do see things in Iran, we're also likely to see things in Nigeria and things in other parts of Africa as well.
Does this concern you? Remember your hard and fast rule about not investing in gambling stocks for the moral issues. Yeah. Does this not concern you?
No, not particularly, because even the stories, the only thing about this whole Turkcell thing which worries me is the $200,000 payment to the ex-South African ambassador in Iran. Because if that's true, if they bought him a house in Fairy Glen, that's a problem, because that's like a direct bribe, because how else can you explain it? Having some minister of something or other in Iran who they retained on the payroll, that's the kind of thing you do when you go into a country where you don't know who's who and who's important and who's not. So I don't worry
at all
about
the sort of thing that you should be doing?
Well, remember Bobby Godsall talking about trying to mine gold in places like Mali and so on. Half the time you can't work out who the good guys and the bad guys are, let alone work out whether you should pay them or not. So I don't worry about that, to be honest. I'm much more interested in a potential loss for MTN if the US basically tightens sanctions and if there's a war between Israel and Iran. That would be very negative. But I think that's kind of baked into the price, not the war, but the fact that there's this mess in Iran at the moment.
How long is it going to take to resolve these issues? You would have thought good investor relations would have come in hard and fast. We would have seen an investigation done and clearance being given to MTN, but that's not the situation. No, this is dragging on.
This is going to drag on. I mean, the Iranians aren't like the Iraqis. They aren't going to fall like next week or whatever. They see what happened in Libya. They are not likely to give up that nuclear power. I mean, look at Gaddafi. He gave it up, and a few years later, he was dead. And the Iranians are, maybe not insane, but they certainly are very, very self-serving, and they're not going to give up, what they think is their only lifeline, in terms of, protection against an American invasion. So we are going to see this drag on for a long time. And if MTN wants to maintain its presence in Iran, it's probably going to be involved in it as well.
Hot or not on MTN?
Look, despite of all things I've said so far, I do think that the case that Paul has mentioned is quite strong. So if I'm going to put in the fence here, I wouldn't mind putting a few bucks in MTN at the moment.
Hot or not,
Hot.
Viv Govender. Thank you very much. Paul Theron.
If you can get them at 130 in weakness, hot.